I'm happy about that.
I think we're just going to...
Do we need to share screen?
Yes, I think that's what we're going to do.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's easy. Go get your drinks now. It's time. There is time. That looks more like your screen sharing. But now, okay. Thank you. Got it.
Thank you, everyone. Okay. Sorry about that.
All right, so I'm not starting over. So I just, I'm going to do one thing in case I need one. So my goal is just to tell you a little bit about NOAA and kind of what we have in our mix, what we have to do with One Health, and some examples. So marine mammals, El Nino, Zika, remember that. They're actually connected, maybe not to each other, but they're definitely connected to NOAA. So what they have in common is NOAA and the environmental piece of that. So that's going to be the piece that goes throughout this whole thing. And then I think at the end, I'd like to, the intent of this is how do we actually move forward in our brave new world. So I am not going to spend a lot of time on this one because everybody here already knows what we're talking about in terms of One Health. I just point out that for us in NOAA, the animals include the marine environment, not just the terrestrial, and actually we have health expertise in marine animal health. We don't have public health expertise. We're not veterinarians except for our head vet for NOAA runs the marine mammal mortality and the marine mammal unusual mortality events work. So we actually have a piece of the animal health component that is often overlooked and not very well understood in terms of human disease transmission. And the last point here, let's see if I got this right. I get except for those on the phone, right? So the reason we have a One Health approach and not a program at NOAA, we have pieces of this puzzle. I don't run a $10 or $15 million program, but across our agency, we have a lot of capacity. So what I'm going to talk about here is the capacity we have and how it ties to One Health or how it could tie to One Health. And you guys can help fill in the blanks because we're only a piece of this puzzle. That last piece there, though, that's in red, prediction and prevention, the whole point of using this environmental information, forecasts, products, El Nino predictions, climate change predictions, weather predictions, is to help us get ahead of the curve. We want to get beyond this traditional surveillance and response mode, and I know you all know what I'm talking about, and we all are aiming for that, and we still aren't there. It's a culture change as much as it is a technological change, as much as it is a data gap. And it's all three of those that take all three disciplines to make us work and behave differently and be better prepared, not in an emergency response mode, but to do something to actually prevent it from happening months ahead of time, years ahead of time, to plan differently, to plan our infrastructure differently, to plan our response differently so that we don't need to be in emergency response mode all the time. We can do a better job, and we just have to work together a little harder to do that. And we might need a little money, but that's a different story. Okay, so NOAA's, our fearless leader, former astronaut Kathy Sullivan, we are the Environmental Intelligence Agency. We do monitoring, modeling, observations, assessment, forecast products. I think most of you know, I actually do have the dreaded org chart here, but for a specific reason. Most of the capacity we have has ties to human health, but we're not a human health agency. So we have to and want to work with those of you who do animal and human health pieces to make those connections. And the whole idea is to use this information to mitigate some of the emerging risks that we think are coming and figure out how much to do. There's some things you can do without a huge heavy lift and a huge burden that are just good things to do anyway that might get you better prepared in case there is an outbreak. So let's say there's an El Nino coming and you think there's going to be a malaria outbreak somewhere, or let's take dengue at the border. We think there's going to be a higher risk of dengue. What things could you do that are good to do anyway before you go into a full-blown outbreak response that you know ahead of time? So using this kind of information, both the data, the models, the forecast, and collaboration in the research piece of this collaboration in the research piece. That's the part I think people don't think of with NOAA. You know we're the data people, you know we do the forecast stuff, but we actually have a lot of research that's not just climate-based research and not just ocean research and not just observational-based research. We know that we have to collaborate with those of you working in the sector, for us, the sectors, the health sector and the water sector, to actually answer those problems, really to understand what you need and to begin to speak the same language. So in a One Health context, that means working with people who do animal and public health. And, you know, some crossover with environment. Looking at the EPA table here. So I'm not going to go into this whole thing, but I just wanted to ask you before, I should have done this before I put the slide up, how many of you have heard of the Weather Service? Okay, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? How many of you knew that NOAA was in the Department of Commerce? I did pretty good. How many of you knew that the Weather Service was a part of NOAA? Okay, well, it's a DC audience. That's good, because just don't tell the Weather Service. They sometimes think that they're their own thing. The good part about the Weather Service is that they have a very operational capacity. So once they decide to do something, they're going to do it. They're going to do it 24/7. The process of getting into an operational mode with them is, you know, literally like a foot of documentation. Literally, I'm not kidding. It's huge. But, you know, there's 3 levels of continuity of operation when they do it. So getting to a product that is operational in some context is a big deal. Finding and determining what the best use of those resources is really critical. So that's why we engage in research. That's why we want to work with you guys on this stuff. I put this also up because we have, this is our satellite and environmental data. So we house data for the World Meteorological Organization. We have global data sets. We house them on behalf of other countries and on behalf of international organizations. So we have huge data repositories and people who know how to use them. They don't always know how to talk health. We kind of get in the middle of that, but we do get there. We have the Fisheries Service, which is both the marine animal folks are there, fisheries, both regulation and monitoring and health assessments. So the regulatory part of our agency is in fisheries. We work a bit with FDA and EPA a bit on some of the water quality issues. Ocean Service, the Weather Service, Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, which is where I sit, that's where the research arm is. We have lots of labs. We do climate modeling, downscaling, seasonal predictions. The Weather Service does the actual forecast product. So, and then OMAL, that's where the P3s and all the cool stuff, ships and stuff that you see flying through hurricanes, that's all those guys. And the oil spill response people, that's, I'm not going to pretend to tell you what OMAL is because nobody even says anything but OMAL anymore. I can't even remember. So don't tell them that. So we have data, observations, forecasts and warnings, predictions and scenarios, different timescales, training and capacity building, both domestic and international. From how do we bring that to bear on health? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our ecological forecasting products because they apply to the health sector. That's part of my job. They don't always apply as well as they could. Early warning systems at multiple timescales. Again, training and capacity building. And then in order to execute this well, right now we have an MOU with CDC, we have one with USGS, and I'm not going to get too much more into government speak except that sometimes it's easier to work if there's an official document, and the NOAA and CDC MOU started between 2 programs and ended up being between the entire agencies, and was a huge deal. So it allows us to work on health issues. We don't have that specifically for One Health, or we don't have that with the veterinary group per se, but that's a model we can do. So I can't take this long with every slide because I'll never make it through. So I'm just going to go kind of briefly through what this One Health group is and why I'm here. The agency was funded and put money into climate health, oceans and health, marine animal health, fisheries health, fish assessments, ecological health. And yet still our leadership was saying, oh, what's NOAA doing on health, right? So health is pretty broad. To them, it's like we don't do health. Our science advisory board a few years back said, there's no question but you do health. Just go do it and get yourselves organized. And so there's a lot of back and forth, and you can imagine the interagency, the internal stuff about that. But there was this working group that was stood up with those of us who are already working or funding in this issue. And that's how the Oceans and Human Health Working Group, the Oceans and Health Working Group and the One Health Working Group eventually came to be in 2010. So we actually started to try and integrate the data we had on marine animal die-offs, we were having some harmful algal bloom problems in the Pacific Northwest that particular year with fisheries and with human health outcomes with USGS. And trying to just get our own data, with the sea surface temperature data, it was, challenging. And so we set up our own internal working group, which is basically you put the Science Advisory Board, our own internal efforts to try and talk with ourselves among our own data and models, which sadly is still a challenge, but we're getting better. That's how we ended up with this One Health working group. We had a workshop that was focused internally, and we came up with we didn't really come up with a mission. It was kind of given to us by our Science Advisory Board, but basically understanding, so we wanted to be able to do research with partners on the impacts on human health, wildlife, and resource management, basically. So our group is comprised of people across our agency. They agree to be coordinated. We do joint budget planning. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not, but we don't have one big program. We have a lot of coordination, we have a lot of capacity, and each one of the pieces I'm going to talk about has partners that are not listed here. The partner depth is rich, and if I were to put a slide up for partner, it would just be a bunch of acronyms. It's amazing how much the people on the ground, the researchers, are actually doing. So these are the basic theme areas. We came out of that. It was not predetermined at all. You'll notice that the Arctic region is the only region. We originally did not address regions. We said, oh, we'll do that next year or the year after, and we sort of have done it by default. We thought the Arctic was special enough that it deserved its own attention, and yet still found it incredibly challenging to figure out how to navigate that Arctic One Health group with the capacity we had from our observational capacities to the marine animal health people, the zoonotic piece. It's still a challenge, and that's why I'm really sorry Becca's not here, because that's now her job, which is great. So we definitely, we do have regional efforts now, but it was not a formal part of our structure. So now we have our regional nodes as well, but that wasn't originally the thing. And Ed, I couldn't have paid you to say what you did, although I might have, because the reality is that this isn't a climate and health talk, it's a One Health talk, but the reality of it is that climate affects so many of the pieces of what we're talking about. So I'm going to structure this talk a little bit more heavy on the front end with a little bit of climate as it drives some of the other sectors and the impacts in the other sectors, and a little bit more on heat because we have a lot of capacity to predict heat and it affects so many of these other things. This is a slide that was developed by CDC for our for our collective use, right? And it's looking at initially sea surface temperatures, CO2 levels, extreme weather events, and rising sea levels. CO2 levels and rising seas. You look at the next layer around, which are the direct effects that are pretty well understood, and then the part that's a little fuzzy are the disease outcomes. And those are always harder to get to because we don't have temporally and spatially compatible data. We don't always have health data. We don't really have models that can do all of that. But those are, for heat, for instance, we have much better capacity to understand heat than we do some of the multiple pathways through which infectious disease is transmitted. But really, we have the observational capacity, we have the modeling capacity, we have the knowledge. Why are we still surprised when Zika shows up, when Ebola shows up? Why are we still surprised? It isn't a vaccine problem. It's an understanding and ecological problem that we just haven't tackled in a cohesive, substantial enough way that we can get ahead of that curve. So that is why somebody asked me before, well, you've been around for, well, they didn't say that. They nicely said, wow, you've been here since 1995. You've got staying power. And I said, I'm passionate. We have all these observational systems, and we're not using them well enough. You in this room, and those of you working on the health issues, at the end of this talk, I'm going to show just a smattering of the observational capabilities, the prediction capabilities. You can drive that train. The relevance that the public health issues bring to the environment and climate community cannot be underestimated. They are health, they are economic, they are stability, they're political. I mean, trust in your political leaders. If your seafood goes bad down south because of an oil spill or because you got a toxic algal bloom in Puget Sound, there are trust issues there. You guys can do so much to help the environmental and climate data be much more relevant if we can just figure out how to get what is most necessary and most needed from you into the system. Sort of that tail wagging the dog thing. Okay, so I'm going to cover a little bit on some of these, more on extremes, a little more on the waterborne and marine zoonotics, okay? This is the other point I want to make. So the first slide was about climate and health. The other piece that I think is really important, and especially important going into the new administration, that it is climate across timescales. Climate extremes are changing. We know they're changing. We know we have more floods. We know we have more heat waves. We know we're going to have more droughts. We're experiencing them now. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. Our skill level on weather timescales is much greater than it is on annual timescales, but we can improve it if it's important. The skill level on projections is even more uncertain, but the targets are a little clearer. So, so we understand the certainty levels across these timescales, and we're trying to really get at a climate to weather or weather to climate timescale. You can tell my bias. Start with climate first. But my point is, it isn't just some long-term scenario projection. These are things that are happening now, and those of you working in the Arctic already know that. This, however, is a long-term scenario. This is a high scenario of projected changes in heat over time, but you can see the 15 degrees. This is one of the high-end scenarios for heat. But look at the world. I mean, it's getting warmer. We already know it's warmer. We know we have more heat waves. We don't know a lot about the character of them, but we should be thinking about that because they are here and they are coming. So even if you don't want to talk about long-term change, you can talk about the extreme events here and now and the ones that we know are coming on a seasonal and interannual and maybe decadal basis. This is a little bit about heat, and I think most of you probably understand that there are urban impacts of heat. Urban heat islands are not an uncommon term, so when you're talking urban, your populations are generally those living in the most vulnerable populations are those living in poor areas without air conditioning, without social cohesion, nobody to check on them. The most vulnerable populations aren't always the ones in the housing projects. So the ones that don't have anybody to check on them, they're the isolated ones. Outdoor workers, huge, especially in cities that are building, or particularly countries that are building. India is actually building. Their outdoor workers, construction workers, are not well cared for, but their industry and their future relies on their construction capacity. So heat affects that. And then, you've got this whole idea of infrastructure and brownout. So if you have high electricity demand in your urban environments, you're going to have more heat waves. One of the infrastructure things is to plant certain trees and certain plants. So what does that do to the vector population? Are we planting the right stuff? Are we creating habitats for mosquitoes that are going to come because it's warmer? I mean, it's not a circular. It can be thought through, but we need to be thinking about it. What are we going to do if we start doing less grass on the soccer fields and do the turf? What are the impacts of that? Is it better to have grass? And these are some of the urban issues. Ecological issues related to heat, and I'm going to get into a little bit more of these, but as these affect human health outcomes, right? So we're getting the ecological perspective. Agriculture, whether it's the workers themselves or the food supply. The food stress, we know for sure that increased CO2 levels affects the nutritional quality of food. That has human health impacts, maternal and child health impacts. We suspect, and there's some studies that show that with the increased stress of a warming climate, that pesticide use will increase. So that affects the crops. It affects the waters. It affects the things living in the waters. It affects the people drinking the waters. Beaches, whether they're freshwater or coastal beaches, the runoff is expected to increase the flow of pathogens and contaminants into those waters. That's one of the key findings of the recent climate assessment. So if people are behaving normally and going to beaches and we're not looking or doing anything to protect them, we're going to have more risk of things like Vibrio alginolicus, the ear infections, or some of the other noroviruses that are moving up. Also, certainly air quality and heat, wildfires, vector-borne disease. I've got a little bit more on those. So my point is that we have a context of climate change. We have a context of warming sea surface temperatures that we know. We have a context of increased heat waves that affect a lot of these ecological systems we're talking about. And we at NOAA predict those things. We do that part pretty well. We do some of these ecological parts pretty well. What we don't do very well is the health outcome part. And that's not our job. So, but we would like to be doing better at it with you. I'll skip that one. I'll pause here for just a second because I don't have a lot on heat and air quality and wildfires because it's not obvious to me the real human health outcome except from respiratory, infection, right? So from my perspective, this is a One Health thing. It's generally in this group we've talked about zoonotics and pathogens. But if you're talking about changes in ecological systems with health outcomes, this is certainly one of them. And we don't really understand enough about how the extreme heat and the changes in heat, just basic heat levels, is going to affect air quality, and what those then in turn do during wildfires. Or obviously we're going to have more wildfires in the future, and that's not even in the future, that's already happening. So we're seeing an increase in those. So if you're looking at even just respiratory infections, the reason I put this in is that when I was talking to the marine animal folks, and Dee maybe over there might have some insight or maybe not. I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, but think about it. Because we had a meeting, and Terry Rolls, who runs our marine animal health program, said something about, well, we have this huge unusual mortality event in the California current off California. And the guy from the Weather Service said, well, we just did a plume model from the fire out there. And she said, well, is there deposition in the plume model? And he's like, well, no, but there could be. And so they went off and, they're working on trying to figure out if there was anything that came out of that wildfire into the water that might have actually caused the event. Don't know, but those are the kinds of things that, if you don't know, you won't find out. If you don't ask, you won't find out. Do we need to be doing more of that? Probably. There's a huge fire experiment right now, and they're running tests of wildfires and how to control them and a lot with them, but we're not actually collecting human health data at the same time. If I had known about it about 2 months ago, I would have called you, but I didn't know about it until last week. So, yeah. All right. And this is an obvious one. I mean, most people understand the connection between, ecological systems and vector-borne disease. But this is for Lyme disease. Look at 2012. This is the projected risk under climate scenarios, the mid-range climate scenario, 2020, 2050, 2080. Not a big surprise. And this is ticks and Lyme disease risk. This is not deer and urban population change, just so you know. So what we're trying to do to tackle the suite of those is to not tackle the suite of all that up front. CDC and NOAA, this is a short version of the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, but CDC and NOAA about a year ago decided that there was a lot going on heat, and that we needed to do a better job of aligning the current heat forecasts that were on the weather time scale and building out seasonal, interannual, decadal, longer-term projections for heat that address the vulnerable populations and the ecological impacts. And we're not doing it all at once, but we did we did what you do. The White House launched it. We had a workshop that actually kind of worked out very well. And the point was to really get the people working on heat to ask each other the same questions about what should be predicted, what should we be doing, and how do we begin to get at some of these other outcomes. That National Integrated Heat Health System and those common core questions, if you have any questions, you should talk to Hunter afterwards, or me, because that's our job, our main job, our day job. But the whole notion of this common questions and learning from each other had such traction. There was really pretty big gap internationally, so we've launched this global heat health information network as well with World Meteorological Organization and World Health Organization, basically. So the whole point is to really harmonize what we're doing on heat across timescales, and then to get to those multiple pathways through which heat affects ecological systems and affects human health. In case you didn't think I forgot about the human health part, so I didn't. I won't spend a lot of time on this right here, but this is what we are doing. This is what we mean by integrated information systems for health, and it basically is a framework that sustains the engagement across the partners over a period of time that links the research demand, the decision makers' needs, the calendar. Are you trying to decide to prepare for emergency? Are you trying to plan your urban centers? Are you trying to pre-position vaccines in some period of time? Sustains that collaboration, identifies what's needed, links it to the Earth observation systems and prediction tools, and actually produces products that decision makers need. The last part there is the most important. It takes a while, and I think everybody in this room who's doing One Health, it's a complicated issue and the pathways are not clear, so it does take some time and patience to actually talk to each other, learn each other's language, and figure it out. And, you know, how many of you been in a project where, like, for the first 6 months you think you know what you're talking about with each other, and then you find out you had no idea what you were saying and you thought you were perfectly clear, right? It's the nature of this kind of interdisciplinary work. So, but institutionalizing that and knowing it and having the people who look for results and fund us, and as a complete aside, when I used to run the Oceans and Human Health program, and that was mostly congressionally funded, and there was a natural products piece of that. And Congress, sorry, is it Matt? No, not Matt in the back. Yeah, I was in that committee then. They wanted me to put all the money into natural products. And I said, okay, I'm in an agency that wants quarterly reports, report to you once a year, and natural products exploration from the marine environment is a 10 or 20-year venture capital process, and you want me to put all of the money into that? Are you kidding me? So I lasted for about 12 years, not only putting a little bit of money in there, and we found a few products, but so the time frame of your funders and your decision makers and who's actually going to use the information is often not really harmonious. At some point over the year, the White House was also really interested in getting in front of this heat issue. They were, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because they were really more interested in just sort of like getting the emergency word out during the heat season. But in the course of that, we had several other agencies added to this team, and we're very happy about that. We have 7 or 8 federal agencies, and we've got a series of, the reason I put this up, sorry, I forgot I'm on phone here, these pilots over here. We've got 4 or 5 pilots in the United States and a lot of international collaboration on heat. And not everybody is just looking at urban environments. Some are actually looking at changes in vector-borne disease and some of the other heat impacts on ecological systems. And heat and vector-borne and waterborne are the most widely looked at throughout the heat portfolio, in addition to the urban environment. All right, air quality. Could be a whole talk on air quality, and instead I just put one slide because I'm not going to focus a lot. I think the piece on wildfires and air quality is important. There's the research gaps in the coordination with EPA. NOAA puts the forecast out. We do some of the monitoring. EPA actually does the real monitoring and puts the forecast. We give the models to EPA. They put the forecast out. I think as a collaboration, that's a good way of going, but what this actually means for public health at state and local levels is more on the EPA and the CDC side of things. So this is, again, where we have a model, and by working with another agency, we put some information out that we hope that we know they are using, but we're not directly using it. I think the heat and air quality issue, what we monitor, and how we actually go forward for aeroallergens in the future is a huge deal. We've been asked to really step up the game on the aeroallergen piece of that. So yeah, Ed's given me a thumbs up. Vector-borne diseases. So again, what am I doing here? What does NOAA have to contribute to this? Are we going to do a malaria forecast? Well, actually, depends on who you talk to. There's a guy on our satellite guys in the office who says he has a malaria forecast, and it makes me crazy because it's basically a vegetation index that he says is a malaria forecast. So aside from that, we actually do have capacity. We can do modeling and prediction, and I'm going to spend a little time on how that happens here because I want you to be thinking about some of these networks and maybe being engaged with them. If you're looking for doing some kind of seasonal prediction or some kind of warning for an infectious disease, we would like to be your partner in that. We have the capacity, but we don't know what the questions are for the health outcomes that you need answered. Our weather service has an international desk. Are you having trouble hearing? Yeah. I could speak louder, but I think they're just having a really good time over there. So vector-borne disease is an interesting piece. It has actually, as NOAA, I feel we have so much capacity. We're working very closely with the pandemic prediction group that's led by the White House. We have supported a dengue forecasting challenge. We have worked on malaria and dengue and chikungunya by default. a little bit on Zika, but we haven't really owned that vector-borne disease piece of it like I feel we could. We have so much capacity, but the piece of that is dispersed through CDC, and it's kind of awkward on the health side to kind of get at that. So what I'm showing you is what we can bring to the table and what we have now. It is, in my opinion, the most potentially valuable and probably the weakest piece that we have right now. So our Africa desk, we have a series of international desks at the Weather Service. They do training and capacity building, and they will do forecasts and the like. And they really want to work on infectious disease issues. They really want to work on zoonotics, even though they don't know what that means. But they like it. And the head of the Weather Service is hugely invested in pandemic prediction. Loves it. So help me out. So I think there's a huge potential here. We have, yeah, while they're all still in, you know, it's a timing game. In Africa, we have two specific projects that were actually funded, one in Tanzania, one's in Mozambique, on climate and health and producing useful information for, I said Mozambique, didn't I? It's Senegal. Sorry, it's a different project in Mozambique. Just had 2 workshops and had pretty, no, not pretty strong, very strong engagement from the health community and the health ministries of health, ministries of environment, and the finance officers in Tanzania. I don't know in Senegal if we had finance there, but the person who was holding the workshop was from Senegal, so I think he kind of knew everybody. I'm not really sure how that worked. But lots of us were at the Tanzania workshop. So the point is that we do modeling, we have data, we do predictions for the entire country, and we can downscale and work with people in the country. We don't do it for Africa. We work with folks. We go in and talk to the Met Service and get the data and actually help get the model to the right scale to the extent possible. There is an Asia desk and a monsoon desk, depending on part of the world. I'm showing you this because this was something we did as a prototype that could be done. This was more than just NDVI. 2014. Unless there's a demand and we have a partner, we're not going to operationalize anything like this. But this is something that we could do or could certainly improve upon. It's pretty rudimentary. Okay, 2 minutes on these things called climate outlook forums. How many of you are internationally focused? Okay, the rest of you mostly domestic. To make a climate forecast, people spend their lives doing that. I'm going to give you the short version in 30 seconds. Basically how it works in a foreign country is where you have all these models, you've got 7 or 8 or 10 big modeling centers, and all these guys with their big models come and sit down at the table with folks in a region who have their models, and seriously, it works kind of like this. Well, I don't know, my model says this. I don't know, I think maybe, do you think the rainfall should be about here? I don't know, maybe a little bit more like here. Well, I don't know. So seriously, there's a lot of back and forth, and there's some hand drawing. It does actually get real. There's real science behind it. But in the end, well, no, it can't go there because the mountain range is there. I will draw it a little bit this way. But the forecasts are actually validated. They've been doing this long enough that this is a consensus process for making a forecast that everybody agrees to, uses the most appropriate data for the season. Some models are better at the rainy season. Some models are better at the dry season. So there is a well-adapted process for doing these climate outlooks. And that's why I asked if you're working internationally. So if you want climate information from a community, more than just a country, because sometimes you need a regional, the climate folks are also underfunded, much like public health are. So, you know, you can't just go to a climate person or a Met office in a country and say, give me your data, because they won't have time. They won't know what you're talking about. They don't know what health people are. Their boss didn't tell them it was okay. This is your way to get that, okay? So if you're interested, let me know. There's a whole group of those. They meet regularly. They produce a forecast. They've only now, recently, just done the first one for anything health-related, and it was for heat and based in Sri Lanka. Could be more. All right, waterborne disease. Any questions so far? Okay, 2 more. Waterborne and then marine zoonotics and Arctic kind of combined. I won't spend too much time on this one because I think most of you are quite well aware of the whole connection between, you know, contaminated water, whether it's pathogens or chemical contaminants, drinking water, recreational water, shellfish consumption. This, to me, is a One Health issue, and the reason I put it on the table here is that, as I said, I feel like we have a lot of capacity on the pathogen and the marines and the zoonotic piece and the pandemic part, which we haven't tapped into. This part we do we do better, in part because we are the ocean agency and the coastal agency. We sort of feel it's our purview, and we have well-established partners. But I also think it's very much a One Health issue that we haven't really, at least in the worlds I'm in on the One Health side of things, you don't hear about waterborne diseases as much in One Health as you do the infectious disease part. So I think I'd like to hear some discussion about whether you think that's an important focus for this as well. For me, it's things like one of the key findings of the climate and health assessment that came out of the government recently was the third key finding of the water chapter, and I don't know them all that well, but I was involved in the water chapter, was water infrastructure failure. And with increasing flooding and extreme events, the water sanitation systems, whether it's drinking water or coastal water, is going to fail, and they're going to fail more. And you put that on top of the Northeast, where we already have hugely aging infrastructure. You've got, this is not rocket science when it happens. We can see it's unfolding in front of us. So we're going to have more Toledos and probably more Flints and things like that, which, again, have not just human health, but economic and political implications as well. This is my Vibrio side coming out. I'm sorry, I'm a Vibrio person. I became one over time. I don't know, it just happened. But I know, I'm a Vibrio or have. And when I was in graduate school, it was tuna or salmon. I was a tuna person, now I'm a Vibrio person. Go figure. But the reason there's a thread here. We know a lot about these different Vibrios, and I think most of you probably know. I'm not going to go into the basics and insult you, but the ones that infect you through shellfish consumption, the wound infections, highly fatal, and then cholera, as you know, highly fatal. We actually do have Vibrio cholera in our waters. We just don't get cholera because our water infrastructure is good so far. So far, right? Fingers crossed. So ecological forecasting, I mentioned that up front. So we do that ecological side of things. We work pretty closely with FDA. There's somebody from FDA in the room, I think. Yeah, there you go. Hi. We should talk. I think our agencies are talking now. But anyway, we work pretty well with FDA on the Vibrio forecasting. We have the models that do the ocean temperature. We have not great resolution for them, but there are forecasts that are being operationalized for Vibrios in 6 or 7 places around the United States, starting in the Chesapeake Bay. And we do an awful lot of monitoring, water quality monitoring, sampling, and stuff. The human health impacts are both from shellfish consumption and from wound infections and from even ear infections. Algelinicus is actually moving northward because the sea surface temperatures are moving northward. So people swimming in coastal waters that are not expecting it don't treat their kids' ears, and they go to the ER, and the doctors don't know, and it becomes a pretty big problem, and some ear replacements required after if it's not treated in a timely enough fashion. So Vibrio forecasting. If we were to work a little bit more comprehensively, I think we could have national capacity for this. The reason that this might be important is that we know a lot about the sea surface temperature drivers for Vibrios, and this projection is also from the latest climate and health assessment. This is not a Vibrio. This is a Vibrio risk prediction because it's based on sea surface temperatures and 5 model runs. Even though there's 4 here, there are actually 5. Long story. But you can see the change in risk for Vibrios in Alaska as you go over time. This is basically coastal changes in sea surface temperature. And we're already seeing Vibrio outbreaks from 2004, and they are increasing in frequency. So there are lots of implications for those of you working in the Arctic. I've got a section on that in a minute. But we picked Alaska because we could and because we knew there would be a problem there. And just noteworthy, there are 27 tide gauges in Alaska. There are 27 tide gauges in Delaware. Seems like a bit of a problem, but okay. We also do harmful algal bloom forecasting. Sorry, I didn't mean for that acronym there. We have operational forecasts in Tampa Bay and the Great Lakes, especially after the Lake Erie algal blooms in Toledo. We're working on them in Puget Sound and in Chesapeake Bay. Puget Sound's complicated. It's probably not going to come online real soon, but we do have some observational capabilities. So again, harmful algal blooms affect shellfish. They affect marine mammals. They affect marine mammal health. They affect livelihoods through consumption of food and also through the engagement, whether it's a food supply or recreational water quality engagement with marine animals and the cultural aspects of that. One of my favorite stories, which is both a One Health and an economic story, when the razor clam fishery in the Pacific Northwest is in. It's like a generational cultural thing. This is not an indigenous population. Who was it? You were there. Did you ever do the razor clam fishery?
I did not.
You did not. I know. They're kind of scary. I don't know. It's a cultural thing. I was invited and I went once and I just like, but families go for generations. And one year it was closed because there was a harmful algal bloom and they closed it. And people like practically rioted. So now like they have signs above the highway that say, you know, fishery open or closed, and it's a big deal to make sure that people don't come because they were like, they took vacation time and brought their families and their grandma and their babies and like couldn't go. So, you know, again, that trust issue. All right, now I'm getting into dangerous territory because the Marine Animal Health Program is an amazing program that NOAA has. And these are the folks who have both the zoonotic piece of this One Health mission and the marine animal health responsibility directly. They are focused on both baseline disease and health surveillance for marine animals, working very closely with the Marine Mammal Commission. Any unusual mortality event or investigation, we will go if we are asked by another country, and we have a pretty good capacity in the United States, so we are often asked. And I don't know the percentages, but I know the people involved, and I'd say probably like 80% of the time, if there's an unusual mortality event around the world, either our head vet from NOAA or the Marine Mammal Commission are there to do the investigations. The other thing is the Marine Animal Health does a lot of mapping. They're beginning to try to map some of these zoonotics so we can begin to get a sense of where they are and what the ecosystem dynamics are at the time. So as diseases change, as the sea temperature changes, and as the water quality in which the animals live, which is kind of hard because they're migratory, we understand that. The top picture is a live capture dolphin doing some health assessment there. I don't know the people, but we do a lot of that. So this gets to marine mammals and Arctic examples next. So what's going on? We've seen a lot of avian influenza outbreaks in marine animals, particularly the pinniped population in the Northeast, 2011, 2012. Huge strandings and die-offs. The harbor seals had receptors for avian and mammalian influenza. We saw it circulating in the population. We're tracking it. What is the connection between that and other strains of flu? What is the mixing? What are the environmental drivers for the strain that's circulating, the dominant strain? There are lots of questions also about with the Arctic opening up and changes in migration patterns for the marine animals and the seabirds. What's the strain of flu that's circulating up there? And can we do any monitoring that helps us get ahead of the curve, which virus is likely to be, you know, that strain of, you know, human influenza in particular? What's the connection between these two? We've done a fair amount of research, but we haven't, you know, we don't know exactly if we see this in a marine animal, this is what it means for human population, but they're certainly connected. We're seeing a lot of changes in the avian influenza in marine animal populations, also in the Arctic, but this study was particularly northeast. Let's see that. Okay, so the last piece is in the Arctic, and then I have a few little wrap-up slides that we can hopefully talk about. I actually kind of already covered this. The reason we focused on the Arctic as a priority for the One Health group is knowing that it was, you know, already a case study, not waiting to happen. It was already happening. You know, I think that the 2 times faster than average for global warming and all the permafrost melting and the huge amount of problems up there. I mean, these are folks who can't even get their food supply. They can't get to their food because the ice is melting. They either can't get out to the animals to hunt, they can't get the animals back if they've caught them, or they get stranded out and die on an ice floe because they can't get back. They can't store it because the permafrost is melting. The food that they used to store just in the ice is contaminated. Sewage is a problem, just say, in terms of further contamination because of the permafrost, and the planes that deliver supplies just can't land in some places anymore. They just can't get there. So if those things are happening with the critical infrastructure for just basic existence, we already know that the caribou and the tundra, like the terrestrial animals, are shifting. We know for a fact that the marine animal populations are shifting. So it's a food supply, it's the quality of the food, the diseases that are in the food, the access to the food, and the nutritional quality of it. On top of that, you have, no, let's stop for a second. On top of that, when you have species distribution, this part I don't know as well because I don't know the terrestrial piece, but from what I've read, Andy Dobson's work and others, you know, the changes in the caribou population and where they are changing the distribution of ticks and other diseases, vector-borne diseases that they haven't had. And if you remember back, I'm sure you do, the heat map that I showed you first, some of the warmest warming is in Alaska. So you've got, you know, sea ice melting, permafrost melting, warmer warming, changes in, yeah, I know many of you are working on Arctic, so I don't need to go into too much, but that is the quintessential sad experiment for One Health. But if we don't learn from it and do something, we should all be ashamed. This could be a whole talk on this one slide, so I'm not going to. The point here is that in the past, the primary food source has been phytoplankton when we've had ice algae. I mean, the ice algae and phytoplankton has been secondary when you've had the ice sheets, and now that you have melting ice sheets, phytoplankton is much more the primary food source and the ice algae is second. That's a fundamental shift in the food supply and the food chain and the food web up there. In addition to changes in the migration patterns from the caribou and some of the food sources, and in addition to the changes in the migration patterns for the marine animals on which they rely for culture, food, and other things. So we're really looking at a, you know, a fundamental shift in livelihoods, cultures, food, health, among other things. I think in the sake of time, I will skip that. Just further information about how we look at One Health and what's going on in the Arctic and how we can use that to either to help what's going on up there, ameliorate the situation, at least make aware of what's going on. I think that's happening. There's a lot of stuff going on across the federal government for Arctic, and so much it's hard to even track. But I know that some people in the room at Washburn might have been very influential in getting a One Health focus in some of the Arctic work. So was that you? Okay, all right. Really important. Unusual mortality events are happening more frequently, and there are more of them. The ringed seal, the ringed seals, they never really knew what happened, as far as I know. I mean, just never knew what happened. The seals would just wash up with skin just gone, and they didn't really know. And half the population showed up again the next year. So I mean, and we still don't know what happened. But the disaster for the walrus hunt on St. Lawrence Island, they had to declare a disaster because there were just no walruses. That's their food supply. They use the oil for heating and energy. I mean, they used every part of the walrus. No food. And later that year, they had the avian cholera outbreak. Took out all the seabirds. So they're trying to eat everything, and there was nothing to eat. I mean, it's probably not going to be uncommon. And actually, that last point, Streptococcus syndrome, that's not an Arctic issue. What's happening? I don't know that there's even a known temperature threshold, but wasn't that the first time it was seen in the Arctic? Yeah. It's nuts. Okay, so that's a very messy slide, and I'm almost done. You guys are doing really well. So back to NOAA. What do marine mammals, El Nino, and Zika have in common? We have the environmental information. We do have the marine animal health people, so there's a little bit of both here. But we observe everything. Not as much. If you ask the observing people, if do we have enough, the answer is no. And actually, seriously, 27 data buoys, tide buoys off of Alaska is not enough when you've got 27 in Delaware, and that's barely enough. But the fact is, we do have the capacity to observe the Earth in situ from drifting buoys, boats, ships, planes, satellites. NASA's got satellites. We work with NASA a lot too. I don't mean to leave them out here, but we do the in situ stuff for sure, and we work with them on the satellites. Theoretically, they do the research and we operationalize them, but it doesn't always work that way. So the point is that we have huge networks that can be deployed either directly for data use in your own analysis, for building a different type of prediction that might be useful for you that we're not doing now. Like I said, that's a little harder. You got to be clear about why you need it and what it's going to do. But this is a huge capacity that we have at our agency that has, I think, enormous potential to inform and provide to help us get on the One Health front, that prediction and prevention rather than the surveillance and response. And this is, again, the tail wagging the dog. These folks are, making a pitch to Congress about why it's important to have an ocean buoy in the middle of the Pacific and why that array is important. Well, it's important because we need that to understand El Nino. Okay, well, that's great. Why is that important? There's a cascade of things, and it is actually really important. To do the heat forecast, we need buoys in the middle of the ocean to do that. But that's a pretty hard thing when you're talking to somebody in an elevator in 5 minutes. So we really do want to make sure that we are observing the right things and making the right forecasts at the right time and space to make it useful. And my job is to make it useful for health. So yeah, the reason I put this in is so I wouldn't forget, which I'm glad I did. Not only do we have the big observing systems, but we actually do a lot of marine genomics, and I wouldn't say a lot. We used to do a lot more, and we still have a lot of capacity. We do all the way from satellites to the genomics work, and we actually put, these are environmental sampling processors that go on buoys, and we're testing those for doing rapid assessments for harmful algal blooms and Vibrios. Vibrio one didn't work out so well, so they're going back to the drawing board, but sensors. So sensors for everything from, microbes to genes to satellites. And why are we doing it? Okay, so you guys have seen this all a lot. General epidemic curve, here's where we are, first case. By the time anything happens, whether it's in a marine animal population, a human population, probably an environmental ecosystem, although I don't know how much this really applies. I think it should. The other two I am sure. Point of me being here and talking with you and hoping that we collaborate a little bit differently afterwards is that if we actually use the observational capacities, the forecast models, talk with you on a regular basis and discuss with you and figure out what you need, and when you need it, we can use all of that capacity to get ahead of the curve so that we have a heads up. So like in malaria, for instance, in Africa, we know there's a temperature threshold. And so what happens there, at least in Kenya and Tanzania, they'll say, all right, there's an El Nino coming. It means warmer temperatures earlier. Don't hold me to that. I can't actually remember the specifics now. But they will monitor then for the temperature and the rainfall. Well, that's not that hard to do. And if they see that, then they'll do some mosquito checking. And if they see that, they do the bed net deployment sooner rather than later. So you get ahead of the curve. You're not caught by surprise. And if you do that, you have a much greater chance of reducing the impact under that curve. And that, in the end, is the end game, whether it's public health or animal health or protecting the environment. It's protecting it because you're using the data and you're using the systems you have in place better, wiser, and more judiciously together. That's it. So, questions? Drinks? You're very patient.
I thank you for doing this because, the four of us or three of us have really struggled with how to bring the One Health approach to EPA. I see our missions as very similar, is that you do have, climate, or you have health, you have human health, you have animal health, and you also have the environment. And, we've been looking at this saying, let's do a One Health approach, but what does One Health approach mean? And we don't have a One Health office, and we're very small like you are, and the idea that people keep saying, well, what difference would it make if we brand ourselves as One Health? Because we've been doing One Health. We are the environment.
Yeah.
We're the Environmental Protection Agency that has human health in the, protecting human health in the environment. So how did you, sell this to your agency?
Yeah, that's right.
No, there's a,
it's the rate of change with global climate change. It's obviously a key driver, but what are the key drivers that force this integration? Because obviously you've been doing these things for a long time. I mean, the monitoring, the modeling, and all that. How, what, you know, why now? I guess in the last X years.
It's a good question, and about 3 different answers for that, and they all there. But it's you know, there isn't just one thing. So I did have money from Congress and had a program and was funding work in this area. I don't know, 60 or 70 million bucks over 5 or 6 years. So it was a fair amount of money, grants and internal. So we had some capacity that, but when I funded it, it was, we required them to work with public health folks or marine animal health. They didn't get pass go as a center or a grant unless they had that kind of collaboration. So we started with, I mean, you can do it even with a little bit of money. So that was one thing. And then the leadership at NOAA at the time, hate to speak this too loudly, but the leadership at NOAA at the time said, oh, we don't do health. I'm like, well, but we do water and we do ag and we do energy and we do drought and we don't do health. What's up with that? So the Science Advisory Board said, no, absolutely. You serve a bunch of communities and health is by far and large a primary audience for you. Go make it happen. So our Science Advisory Board wrote a report back to the head of the agency that then landed on my desk and said, figure it out. And so I did, which was great because what I did, and I'm about to do this again in April, I think. We haven't set the date yet. Maybe we should do this together. So I sent, this is kind of crazy. I should probably do it now before January, and send out a notice across the agency and said, if you're working on health stuff, this is where y'all come, right? Come and just internally, you know, we didn't make a big PI meeting. And I've got like 85 people wanting to come talk about what they were doing. And so in addition to well, including some of the people that I was funding, but there were people that came out of the woodwork. And so we did, and we started, and that was a response to the SAB. We had a funded program, but the funding was waning at the time anyway. And the third thing was the climate piece, but it wasn't driven initially by climate. I think that is it now. The fourth piece that cannot be underestimated is the leadership. I mean, Kathy Sullivan is not a roadblock at all. The head of the Weather Service and the head of the climate program are very, very supportive. And that takes some doing. And sometimes it's just not the right person in the place that you need them to be. And you just have to find a different way around or wait. And so all of those things came together, not quite in the perfect time. It would have been nice to have had the leadership on board a little bit when I had the funding, but you know, it just, so it was a process. But we started the first climate and health program with NOAA, NASA, EPA, NSF, and the Electric Power Research Institute in 1997, 98. And it was looking at ecologically mediated disease transmission, climate and other drivers, but looking at the ecosystem part. And that began the socialization process. And then the funding for the Oceans and Health program came in 2003, and then it was pretty big. And it was during that time that we had all the money. The leadership was like, we don't do health. And then eventually they're like, okay, went away, and that's how it happened. So it's a leadership issue, a little bit of funding to get things started, but I would say I was overwhelmed with the amount of response I got in the agency. We're going to do the same thing again. I don't know what we'll get this time because there hasn't been much money on it. And that's how it happened. And actually the leadership still, you know, when the new science advisor came in, he asked for a briefing on the One Health program, and when taskers come in, they know that it's a conduit, and we struggled a little bit with how formal to make it because we didn't want a bunch of reporting requirements that didn't allow us to push on a budget line somewhere, honestly, because, you know, we were all doing this, nobody was funded dedicated specifically for this. People have actually gotten funding from other programs to do One Health pieces, and we do coordinate, and we put some budget initiatives together, small things inside that have been successful. So the informal network worked well. I think right now, though, we are actually looking for a little bit more structure, so a little bit more of a reporting train. I think there's a trade-off. You know, one, you get the work done. The other one, you institutionalize it, and I think we're enough now. We need to institutionalize it.
Yeah, I guess I was going to ask. Yeah, then is where you maybe starting getting a little more pushback. Mm-hmm. And maybe you've sold it, so I mean, it seems like you developed examples, you can sell it very well, but it sounds like the way you've evolved this, there haven't been, I would say, losers within the organization budget-wise.
Right.
Now they're going to be, maybe.
Maybe. Yeah.
So I'll ask you a question I've asked many times. Tanya knows where it's going. So have we reached the point where we need a center of gravity, a coordination hub in the federal government for One Health?
Yeah.
Because we have pockets and there isn't one place that we tend to meet by accident or coming to the One Health Academy and knowing Juli, but there should be some more centralized, coordinated effort.
That's a really good question. So the U.S. Global Change Research Program, Climate Change and Human Health Group, we wrote charter, and it has One Health in the charter. So I push pretty hard on that group, which is dominated right now by the climate assessment. Climate isn't the only driver for One Health, but right now that is the only place that I'm aware, except now in the Arctic, where One Health exists as a mandate for a group. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be a dedicated one. I think we also have to be some other conversation I don't really want to have right now because it's very unclear to me, but we could. How do we deal with planetary health, that whole movement for planetary health, and because that's going to confuse things even further. Not that it's a bad thing, but I feel like having a dedicated space for One Health in the federal government would be very helpful, especially if we can do the prediction prevention part from there. I wouldn't want it to just be monitoring, and that the pandemic prediction group that's out of OSTP is trying to do prediction, but they're really on disease prediction from case one. Getting the environmental drivers in there is still a huge challenge. So I would say yes, and I'd be there with you. And we'll drag her along from the Marine Mammal Commission, and then we'll get our congressional stuff. I would think it would be helpful, but I think it has to be in the right place. And I think we should strategize about where as things evolve, because doing it right now doesn't matter, but in the new administration, it might be wise. At least we can hang together.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, a question which is probably, well known to people who are in the federal government and elsewhere, but when you make these projections, does any part of the government do the economic costs of response to these issues? In other words, do you have in tandem a projection of an event and what the animal side and the human health side costs would be if that in fact took place? And if not, why not?
Generally, no. And because we don't have the capacity to do that, the economists aren't joined at the hip with us. We have economists at NOAA, but they're mostly fisheries economists. We have some economists who do program evaluation, but we don't have economists that do the projected economic impact of a prediction. We have folks who do the value of how much, we have folks in the Weather Service who can tell you how much an additional second of a tornado forecast will save in lives. That's the closest we get. But we haven't been able to enlist the economics piece very well, I think. Have you had different success in EPA or anybody else with the economic side of this? It's a huge gap. I agree. No, we're not doing it.
It's not just a huge gap. I mean, here's a Martian landing into the swamp, as it were. But it's not just a gap. It's also an incredible advocacy tool to make the case. And I suspect that going forward, that will be increasingly important as a way of justification. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Do you have any ideas? Do any of you work with economists or do any of that kind of modeling already that we could? Are you an economist? No, I'm not. But what I was going to say is that what you will look at, and I'll be happy to share it with you, is the World Bank has done some work, particularly in economic analysis on both pandemics and also on AMR, which is antimicrobial resistance. And there was a major event at the UN last general session on AMR, and the bank put forward a paper on the economic analysis of AMR. And that might be an interesting sort of backdrop for the kind of thing that you're talking about, which is in fact, in my view, even more complex in certain ways, but very much related. So I'll be happy to share that paper with you if you think it would be useful.
That'd be great. And I think EcoHealth Alliance has, well, you can probably speak to this too. Peter Daszak, I've seen several presentations from him, and so has Tim. There are projections of the cost for this Virome project, the potential value of that, but it's not, it isn't associated with a prediction like what you're talking about. So
I'll give you one name that you can Google it and see it, because she's done a number of different papers on this subject, and it's Olga Jonas, O-L-G-A and J-O-N-A-S.
I'm going to write it down afterwards.
She is, or I'll be happy to write it out or whatever
okay.
is appropriate. But the papers on those issues are her bread and butter.
Okay. That would be great. I think that's a really good point. Other questions? All right, you guys, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Please do be in touch if you want to work. Okay, so one of our traditions, One Health Academy, is to present the speaker. Present the speaker with a flag that was flown over the U.S. Capitol. There you go. I forgot about that. Oh, that's nice. I've seen it done before, and I'm still surprised. I'm not sure what that says about me, but thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk and some good discussion. Really appreciate that. There is more food if you would like to eat the rest of the tacos, and if you could just help us clean up by taking the empty glasses back into the bar and the trash over to the trash can over in the corner by the food tables. And if you didn't sign in, if you could sign in so that we can facilitate the networking, because that is one of the main goals of the One Health Academy meetings is to network. We have people from a variety of backgrounds here, so it'd be really great if we can all stay in contact and continue sharing ideas. So thank you for coming, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you.
And I wanted to, oh, you did such a good job. Your work is so amazing. I love it. I mean, like, when you visited,